How we doing, Jets fans? I'm Glenn Naughton with JetNation Radio and JetNation.com. Be sure to log into JetNation.com where you can register and become a part of what is the most active Jets message board on the web. Great show today. We've got a special guest, Scott Mason from Play Like a Jet, and we are going to cover, of course, a little bit of Aaron Rodgers because you can't have a day go by where you don't do that. We're also going to talk about the person who was most affected by Rodgers' eventual arrival, Zach Wilson, and how it impacts Wilson. And we'll touch on a couple of other topics while we've got him on. How are we doing, Scott?
Hey, Glenn, I have to dispute what you said, though. You said that Zach Wilson is the most affected by the potential arrival of Aaron Rodgers. And that's false because the person who's been affected the most is me. I don't think I've slept in like 3 months. So Zach Wilson, he's probably just doing fine in California with some woman who's in her 40s and in a bikini on the beach or something. Meanwhile, I haven't had more than 30 minutes sleep since the season ended. So yeah, Zach Wilson kind of affected, but me, my life's been turned upside down, Glenn.
I'll tell you what, I got to be honest. When once Trey Wingo said this was going to happen and it was imminent, I had about a 4 nights because I work nights and with the time zone changes and all that, and when news tends to break in the U.S., I had about a 4 night stretch where I was sleeping 2 to 3 hours a night. I was constantly waiting for, and I was like, all right, whatever, I got to get some sleep. And then it kind of becomes obvious this isn't going to happen right away. This could go up to the draft. This could go up until training camp. And you and I have talked about this, and I've seen some people on Twitter who seem to think that's a huge, huge issue and a huge detriment. So why don't we just start there? I've seen your commentary on it, and I had the same thought. I actually tweeted something out fairly similar around that time saying that it's not ideal to have Aaron Rodgers walk in the day before camp, but he knows the offense as well as anyone in that building. The offensive coordinator is in place to teach the offense. You've got Lazard in the huddle now to work with the players in real time on the offense. So even if Aaron Rodgers shows up, you can make the argument, that there won't be the chemistry. Like, okay, that's fair enough. There may be some hiccups and bumps in the road along the way. But if Aaron Rodgers is Aaron Rodgers and this Jets defense plays as well as they're capable of playing, they're what people would expect to be a quote unquote bad stretch might be a 3-2 or a 2-3 stretch before they all get on the same page and start rolling. Is this being overblown by people who just want it to be the case?
Brett Favre joined the Jets on August 8th, and we all know how well the Jets were doing. They were 8-3 and the Vegas odds-on favorite to go to the Super Bowl out of the AFC before he hurt his shoulder. And like you said, there's a chemistry built in with Lazard. He already knows the offense. These are two things Brett Favre did not have working in his favor at the time. And let's also remember that, truth be told, the Jets aren't really going to get Rodgers in the fold until the end of July when training camp starts, because he's not going to these non-mandatory camps and all this stuff. He's not going to be hanging around the facility on a daily basis. He's going to be there when he absolutely has to, which would be the end of July. So there's no real rush from that standpoint. Yeah, you'd like to get him in here for a sense of certainty and all of that as quickly as you can, but whatever. I think what it boils down to for me is, though, Glenn, we've talked about this. Everybody talks about the L word, leverage, but really the Packers, they can hold on to him, but all they're really doing, and I've used this analogy a bunch of times and it really does fit. They've got 4th and 5 from their own 30. They've sent the offense onto the field. Everybody knows they're not going to go for it, and they're trying to draw the defense off sides. And so now they're just trying to wait to see if the defense, in this case, Woody Johnson, panics and does something stupid, and then they're able to get more than they should. Otherwise, they're going to call timeout and have to take what the Jets are offering, whatever that is. Because, look, this is a point that that Ryan Schlipp of the Packernet podcast made on my show. He said, we all keep talking about this and arguing over the compensation, but nobody really knows what the holdup is. For all we know, Joe Douglas is offering a 7th round pick and the Packers are like, no, we want a 5th rounder. I doubt it, but I'm just saying nobody really knows where this is at. And if you look at the Packers, they can hold out, sure. But realistically, we've talked about this. Matthew Stafford, assuming he's medically cleared, which it sounds like he is, and he's already said he definitely wants to play. we had that report a few days ago that the Rams would be more than happy to move on from him because they're in rebuilding mode and all that. Ryan Tannehill, yeah, is coming off an injury, but Ryan Tannehill, before he got hurt last year, how many years in a row did the Titans go to the playoffs with Ryan Tannehill? He's good enough to win with if you have a solid roster, and you would imagine that at $27 million and Tennessee basically taking a hatchet to their roster, they'd welcome a chance to get a draft pick and move on. You've also got the potential for other guys to be available. We talked about this, Glenn. If Minnesota decides to move Kirk Cousins, there's talk they may make a run at Lamar Jackson. Jared Goff, if the Lions pick a quarterback, maybe they're willing to move him because he's only on the franchise tag right now. So you have Tannehill and Stafford, who are pretty solid options right off the bat. But look at the Packers, right? They would have to pay, and I was joking with you about this, but this is the scenario that could play out. The Packers are on the hook for over $100 million in guaranteed cash. I'm not talking about cap hits because we can get into that too. Cash. So Rodgers is due $60 million in cash by the first week of the season. So they're saying, oh, we can hold on to him until the first week of the season. Yeah, you can. But the problem is, as you said, there's no one else that wants him because his contract is horrendous for a variety of reasons. Aaron Rodgers could theoretically hang around with the Packers until the first week of September, get paid $60 million in cash. And the second that money touches his hands, he retires, and that's it. There's nothing the Packers can do about it. They just handed him $60 million. Now, here's the other scenario that he could force too. In February, 5 days after the Super Bowl next year, he would be due another $40 million guaranteed cash. So at that point, the Packers would have to decide, do they want to give him that $40 million or let him walk for free? So basically, if Rodgers really wants to force this, he can make them pay him $60 million to just chill. And I would imagine the Packers would probably tell him, don't show up, just hang out at home. So he can hang out at home, go on ayahuasca journeys or whatever for $60 million for the year. And then if he wants, the Packers are definitely not giving him another $40 million guaranteed. He just waits until 5 days after the Super Bowl. They release him and he goes and plays wherever the heck he wants. So the Packers have one team bidding. They have to get rid of this deal. And I've seen Packers fans say, oh, well, they don't have to. They could pay him $60 million. They've had it earmarked. Yeah, okay. If you believe that, I'll introduce you to the Tooth Fairy. There's no chance they're paying this guy $60 million in cash. Everyone knows that. And I saw some Packers fans say, oh, well, they were going to give Brett Favre $20 million to walk away. Listen, they were going to give Brett Favre an annuity for $20 million that would be paid out over like 20 years or something like that. He would be a team ambassador. They would still have him in the fold. They'd be selling merch. He'd do meet and greets, all that stuff. So there'd be ways for the Packers to still make money off Brett Favre all those years. That's not happening with Aaron Rodgers. He's not just going to say, oh, yeah, sure, we can take this $60 million and we can spread it out over 60 years and blah, blah, blah. He's going to do them no favors. And we talked about this before we started recording, Glenn. If you pay attention to what Rodgers said during the McAfee interview, he mentioned about reworking the money. He didn't say anything about taking a cent less, which he will not do, and nor should he. I wouldn't. He's only saying that to facilitate a trade to perhaps the Jets, I would assume, because it doesn't seem like anyone else wants him. And he said he intends to play for the Jets. He might be willing to say, okay, you, instead of giving me the $60 million in September, I'll take $20 million in September, another $20 million in January, another $20 million, whatever. But he's not going to give up any of that money. The Packers, if they don't move him, they must pay him $60 million. And now quickly, because I know this show's not really about the Rodgers thing, but still, the cap hits, right? So forget about this year. The cap hit this year, and you can swallow that if you're the Packers. Next year, it's $50 million. And again, we're talking about a guy who they don't want. And by the way, even after he's gone, so if he retires, if he's gone, 2025 and 2026, that's a $61 million dead cap hit. So this is what I keep coming back to for the Jets. Remember, everybody says the Jets have to win right now. They have to win right now. They have to win right now. Realistically, the Jets have a fairly significantly long window because Sauce is going into year 2. Garrett Wilson, year 2. Breece Hall, year 2. The only guy that they have that's a core member of this team, that's a key piece, that is a foundational guy that they have to pay in any due time is Quinnen Williams. Everybody else, they've got time. And they've got 3 top 50 picks coming up in this draft. All of those guys won't have to get paid, right? So you could get a guy like a Matthew Stafford or Ryan Tannehill we talked about. Those guys are absolutely good enough for you to make a run at the playoffs. And in the case of Stafford, the guy won a Super Bowl a year ago. So you get one of those guys, you are competitive, you go in the playoffs, and once you get in the playoffs, who knows, right? And then while that's going on, you're looking for the long-term answer at quarterback, and you have a much longer window. You've got 4 years, 4 to 6 years realistically, if you play it smart with these guys on these cheap contracts and the 3 top 50 picks that you now have. You get Rodgers, and that window's a year, maybe 2. And like I said, the following 2 years after that, you're still on the hook for all that dead money. So the Jets have to be very careful here. That's why if they give up a ton of picks on top of taking that contract, they're basically shooting themselves in the head, because unless Rodgers comes in and they win a Super Bowl in 1 year, which if we're being honest, what are the odds of that? Yeah, it's possible, but it's not like they would be the favorites to do it. They wouldn't even be the betting favorites to win their own division. So to give up all of that and take on that contract for a year of Rodgers, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So that's why the Jets would be smart to hold the line. And I hope that Joe Douglas has explained all of this to Woody Johnson. I hope that Woody Johnson has wrapped his head around it. And I hope that Joe Douglas has the freedom to tell the Packers at a certain point, here's our offer. It's been our offer the whole time. You either take it now, or I'm calling Les Snead and we're closing a deal for Matthew Stafford, or I'm calling Rand Carthon and we're closing a deal for Ryan Tannehill, or I've got Mama Jackson on speed dial. We're going to get a deal done. Because let me just throw this out there real quickly too, and this doesn't get talked about enough, Glenn, and you and I were talking earlier about things that don't get talked about enough. Lamar Jackson, everybody's talking about all this guaranteed money. Again, if your goal as the Jets is to have Aaron Rodgers for 2 years, if he stays those 2 years, you are paying him $110 million in cash, right? So if you're already going to pay Aaron Rodgers $110 million in cash for 2 years, what is the big deal about paying Lamar Jackson, say 170, 180 million guaranteed? It's really not that big of a leap, and you would get Jackson for several more years for that guaranteed money. And the window would be significantly longer because Lamar Jackson's 26. So I'm just throwing that out there. But that's the point I'm making is I would imagine Joe Douglas has these alternative plans in place. He knows who he can get. He knows what the cost would be. And so he knows he can pivot if he needs to. The question, of course, just comes down to Woody Johnson. But all these things that I'm talking about, Glenn, they're not getting talked about enough because all the media is saying is the Jets are desperate for Aaron Rodgers. Jets are desperate for Aaron Rodgers. They're not taking all these things into account. They should. But of course, look, if we're being realistic about it, most of these people are only going to talk surface level stuff because their job is to cover the league, and how much time are they going to spend digging into the minute details the way people like you and I do, because we cover this team every freaking day. So these are things that need to get talked about more, because have fun with Zach Wilson, as if, by the way, Zach Wilson's the only quarterback on planet Earth. Like either that or the Jets are going to go sign a CFL quarterback if they don't get Aaron Rodgers. So that's really what I'm saying is people don't talk about this enough, that the Jets have pivot points, that the Packers do not, and how bad that contract is, even beyond what we're talking about with the cap hits. There's all that guaranteed cash, and even putting aside the fact that, again, the Packers would have to pick up that 5th-year option on Jordan Love and all these other things. It's just not a possibility for them to keep Rodgers. Joe Banner's talked about this over and over again, and it's 100% true, and everyone knows this. Everyone knows they cannot keep Rodgers, and everyone knows that the Jets are the only team that's willing to take him. So do with that information what you will. But like I said, all these people that are coming at you and coming at me with, oh, you could have fun with Zach Wilson. I've said this before. Look, Aaron Rodgers, definitely the number one choice. He's certainly the best option out there, and it's by a decent margin. But if the Jets get Stafford instead and give up, say, a 3rd rounder next year or a 4th this year and a conditional 4th, whatever it is, and they take on 30 million guaranteed and cash instead of all this with Rodgers, and Stafford could potentially give them a few more years as long as he's healthy because he's younger, it doesn't bother me that much, because I'm not expecting the Jets to win a Super Bowl with 1 year of Aaron Rodgers in a stacked AFC. And also, Glenn, let's be honest about it. You and I are long-term Jets fans. We've watched Browning Nagel. We've watched Greg McElroy. We've watched now Zach Wilson. We've watched Bryce Petty. I mean, I could make a whole list. Is one more year of bad quarterback play really going to kill us? No. And by the way, I don't even think that would happen because they would go get Stafford or Tannehill or somebody. But I'm saying, whatever, what's another year? Like I had one guy on Twitter say to me, he's like, you think you can hurt me? I can't be hurt. I'm dead inside. I've done this for 40 years. You can't hurt me. And it's true. So
Yeah, listen, that's for two reasons. Those are the two reasons that I keep, again, you were saying how we talked about things that aren't being talked about enough. I can't get a thought through my head regarding Aaron Rodgers and the Jets without finishing every thought, reminding myself that this is not guaranteed, but very, very likely a 1-year rental. And when I hear that it's got to be one, it's got to be a one, it's got to be both twos, it's got to be 2 1s, I just think to myself, for a 1-year rental, like I don't care how good he is or what his legacy is. This is now if you had a crystal ball without even knowing the results, if you could just tell me, hey man, he's going to give you 3 years, that's a lot easier to digest. Like, okay, that gives you 3 shots at doing something special. But 1 year, and as you said, in the AFC, he just went a decade plus without winning it in the NFC with a much easier road to a championship. Now he's going to come to the AFC where there's this gauntlet of elite quarterbacks, which he certainly belongs in that conversation with them. But to just assume that by getting him, the Jets now have a 60 or 70% chance to go to the Super Bowl, like that's just simply not the case. And again, if it were a 3-year situation, you're greatly increasing those chances. And I might be able to live with saying, look, a 1 is a lot, but you get 3 shots. A 1 for 1 shot for a guy who hasn't done it in forever. And obviously you want Aaron Rodgers on your team, but there's a line that you draw where it just becomes insane to say that, it's okay to give up multiple 1s, and let's throw in Jermaine Johnson. And I can't believe the number of people who are taking this seriously, because it's just so bizarre to me. I mean, I said the other day on Twitter, one fan base is going to be really upset when this deal goes down, because Jets fans, well, a lot of Jets fans, myself, fans like you and me, are just saying there's no way a 1 or a 2 go. Whereas Packers fans are saying there's no way we trade Aaron Rodgers and don't get a 1 and some young players in return. It's insanity. And as to your point, and I've mentioned this on our show, and I've said, I do think the only way that were to happen, like, what you and I would view as a catastrophic trade, is if Woody Johnson panics and says, listen, we had the report out of Indy that Woody Johnson stepped in and nixed the deal for Carr, or told the Jets not to make an offer for Carr, from CBS Sports. I wrote a brief article on that. Listen, I'm not in the room. I don't know that it happened, but it makes nothing but perfect sense. Woody Johnson is the owner of the team, and this is a huge transaction. He wants the big star. So if Woody Johnson is sitting there thinking, I'm the reason we don't have Derek Carr, and if we lose it on Rodgers, I'm the reason we don't have a quarterback, or at least a high-level quarterback. So I need to stick my nose in here and make sure that Joe gets this done no matter the cost. So to your analogy of hoping the Jets jump off sides, and I think you said it. They're hoping Woody Johnson steps in and says, we've got to make this happen now. So it's all going to come down to how patient they are and how much time they're willing to wait.
And Glenn, I should bring up real quick, I'm sorry to jump in again.
Go right ahead.
From a roster building standpoint, right? How we've talked about this, the Jets have failed so badly with all these rebuilds or whatever, but they finally are starting to succeed, because the one thing that Joe Douglas has done is accumulate high draft capital and cash in on it. Now, listen, the Zach Wilson thing didn't work out so far, and the odds are that it never will. But what did Mike Tannenbaum keep doing? He kept pushing his chips into the center of the table, and what ended up happening? Yes, they went to the AFC Championship. The first year, I would say, was a fluke. The second year, they were actually a good team. But then the team completely fell apart because he had no idea how to regroup, right?
No infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly. No infrastructure. Maccagnan, well, okay, didn't know how to draft, didn't know how to acquire players. Idzik, he was only here a very short time, but he had a plan. The problem is he just couldn't execute it properly. His plan was tear it all down and start from scratch. The problem is then he had 12 draft picks and whiffed on 11 of the 12. The only one that was good was Quincy Enunwa, right? But look at what Joe Douglas has done with these trades, right? Darnold, Adams, even to a lesser extent, somebody like Herndon, who I believe was turned into Michael Clemens last year, who's clearly going to be a productive player. It certainly seems that way. Elijah Vera Tucker was a product of that Adams trade, right? Garrett Wilson, a product of that Adams trade. Not to mention, he hit on Sauce Gardner at number 4. And then you see that pick for Darnold gets hit on in the form of getting Breece Hall, right? And so what he's finally been doing is accumulating these young players on cheap contracts and building a core, building a real sound infrastructure. He's got 3 more top 50 picks now to add to that. Why would you take those guys and basically completely divert from the plan? You're building a roster that if you continue to do this right, yeah, you'll still need a long-term answer quarterback. But if you continue to do this right, you will have a roster in a year or two that will absolutely be right in there with the Chiefs, with the Bills, with the Bengals, with the if the Ravens keep them, Lamar Jackson, the Ravens, right? With the cream of the crop at Jacksonville, if they keep building out that roster, the Jets will be right in there. They will be legitimate perennial Super Bowl contenders if they land that quarterback. But if you're going to take that valuable draft capital that you need to continue, because think about it, right? We talked about this theoretically. Let's say the Jets draft Jackson Smith and Jigba at number 13, which is what I'm at the point. That's what I think they should do if he's there. And he's going to be an absolute star receiver. Him and Garrett Wilson together for the next 5-10 years would be just tremendous. And I don't think there's a huge gap between, and we can talk about this another time, I'm sure, as we get closer to the draft. I don't think there's necessarily a huge gap between who the Jets could get a tackle at 13 and who they could get at, say, 42 or 43. But then say at 42 and 43, right, you get a center. Now that could be John Michael Schmitz. It could be Steve Avila. It could be Tippmann. You could even get Luke Wepler, maybe trade that, whatever it is. You get that center, right? Now you've got that piece. And then let's say the third guy you get is a safety, right? Or it could even be another lineman. Maybe it's a tackle. Maybe it's somebody like Savage, or maybe it's somebody like what's his name? The kid from Syracuse, Matthew Bergeron, right? It could be any of these guys. So my point is, you could potentially get 2 starting offensive linemen and a stud receiver, or you could get any combination, but you could get 3 guys that you could have for 5 years on cheap deals to put together with Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall, Sauce Gardner, Elijah Vera Tucker. And then obviously Quinnen Williams will be expensive by this point, but you're building a real foundation of a team that could be a super successful team, one of the more successful teams in the league over the next 5 to 10 years, if you continue to do this right. But if you divert from the plan and you panic and you trade, look, I've seen this thrown out. Well, they're going to trade both second rounders for Aaron Rodgers. Well, why would you do that? You have a chance to add 2 highly impactful, cheap players at positions of dire need with those picks that you can have for cheap for 5 years. For what? For a year, maybe if you're lucky 2 of Aaron Rodgers. It's crazy. And then you're back to what? You're back in the bargain bin. So look, yeah, you want Aaron Rodgers, but you have to be smart about how you do this compensation wise. And look, I get it. A lot of Jets fans are restless. The thing you hear, oh, well, they have had 1 million draft picks and how many games have they won? But yeah, but you're not looking at the bigger picture. The reason why they're in position now that Aaron Rodgers actually wants to be a Jet, or that you're hearing about a guy like Calais Campbell coming and visiting the Jets and all these other things, is because people understand that for the first time since the Mangini Tannenbaum years, where they really built up a young, productive core, they actually have a team that is a year or 2 away. They're right there in the playoff hunt, but they're a year or 2 away from potentially being an elite roster. People talk about that now. They're not an elite roster now. They have some foundational pieces, but they have a chance with the assets they have to become an elite roster in a year, within the next year or so. Why give that away for a year of Aaron Rodgers? Like you said, 1 shot. And also, obviously, all the money and all this other stuff. And more to the point, the fact that the Packers have to get rid of this guy and nobody else wants him. Somebody said, I think it was Jason Fitzgerald, the only worry you have if you're a Jets fan is, what if Rodgers and the Packers can't work out a deal and then they reconcile with Rodgers? I mean, I guess that's possible, but based on what we've seen, I don't think Aaron Rodgers is doing that. And also, here's the other part of it. They can't do that for Jordan Love. How do you go and give Jordan Love the keys to the car?
They gotta look at him.
No, he'll be infuriated. A, he'd ask for trade, and B, what you basically ruined his psyche and all of that stuff. So I don't think that's a realistic possibility either. So when you put all the things together that we just said about building the team and continuing to make this an elite roster, and the fact that the Packers have to get rid of this guy, no one else wants him, why would you do them that favor and screw yourself at the same time? It makes no sense.
Yeah, the way I looked at this very early on when people talked about, the Jets having to give up a 1 or 2 1s or a 1 and a 2, I thought to myself, again, for 1 year of Aaron Rodgers, imagine this had taken place last year and the Packers got a couple of picks from the Jets and they drafted Garrett Wilson and Sauce Gardner. And we were watching them play for the Packers for a year or two of Aaron Rodgers.
Glenn, even if it wasn't the 4th pick, let's say it was
right. Say it was Garrett Wilson and Hall.
And Breece Hall. Yep.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could look at that and say, imagine you're watching Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson doing what they're doing, and in exchange for that, you got 1 or 2 years of Aaron Rodgers. I can't get my head around it. But moving on to the aforementioned Zach Wilson, wanted to touch on this because I've seen you go back and forth with folks on Twitter about this. I've done it several times. I think pretty much the Zach Wilson timeline, I think you and I are pretty much in agreement. We both liked the pick out of BYU. We both thought he was worth the pick in that slot. I've said before, of course I watch prospects every year. Zach Wilson is the first player that I ever, and thank God for YouTube for this. I literally watched every single throw he made his senior year because I wanted to be sure. Like, I wanted to see everything this guy could do. And the number of throws he made with an insane, difficulty level. As much as people want to say, oh, well, look at the level of competition. Listen, we know he played well against Tennessee. We know he played well against USC. But even the softer teams on their schedule, on the BYU schedule, covered is covered. Like, a small window is a small window. I don't care what level of football you're playing at. If you're, let's not forget, they're playing soft schools, but he's playing with BYU, right? Who was the best receiver on that team? Dax Milne, who was damn near, I think he was 1 pick away from Mr. Irrelevant. So that was his number 1 target, barely got drafted. So while we can talk about the level of competition, let's talk about the level of talent Zach Wilson was working with. And that's why his guys were so often covered. And that's what sold me on Zach Wilson, is watching every single throw he made. And it just got ridiculous with the number of tight window throws he made on the run from the pocket. It was 70% completion percentage. I don't care what college you're going to. You talk to me about BYU. Steve McNair did just fine out of Alcorn State. If you're talented, you're talented. If you can play, you can play. And Zach Wilson showed at BYU that he can play. And we see all this revisionist history. The Jets drafted Zach Wilson because of a throw he made in shorts at his pro day. I mean, could you be listen, it's one of two things. You either didn't watch him play in college, which is fine, just admit that, or you're just engaging in revisionist history because you're mad that things didn't work out. I fully endorsed the pick. I wanted him over Fields. I thought he was the right guy to go with. But now you get what has unfolded since he's arrived in the league. An honest assessment of Zach Wilson gets me and you and others called Zach, we're haters now. Like, I wanted the guy, but that doesn't mean I'm going to lie about what my eyes are seeing in front of me. And what we're seeing is a guy who, and I've said this a million times, you have a guy who went from making deep downfield pinpoint throws consistently to a guy who can't hit a screen pass. And he has regressed at a level I've never seen. The fact that people are looking at what and people say to me, well, it's the NFL now. Things are different. I'm talking about a screen pass. I'm talking about a throw that's 10 to 12 yards to your right with no defenders in the area, and he's bouncing the ball in the dirt. I mean, I'm not demanding that he make tight window throws, and that's the reason why he's not succeeding. He's not succeeding because in his head, he's running away when there's no pressure, and he's got the, as I think I said this after the Falcons game last year, he's got the yips that Chuck Knobloch had with the Yankees. It's all in his head. He can't hit a swing or a screen, despite being the most accurate passer in college the previous season. The regression has been unbelievable, but the only thing more unbelievable than the regression to me is the revisionist history that he was never that good of a prospect to begin with.
Yeah, by the way, I should mention, since you brought up Steve McNair, for those that don't remember, Steve McNair went to Alcorn State, which is an HBCU. And there was all this hype building around him because he was throwing for like 500 yards a game and rushing for like 2. It was insane. It was stuff of legend. and everybody wanted to watch him, but obviously those games weren't on TV. It got to the point where there was such a demand for his games that TBS started putting those games on television because people wanted to watch McNair so badly. Now, obviously that wouldn't apply in today's day and age because you could see anything. You go stream something, or there's like 800 million channels where you can see any college football game, but he was that big of a phenomenon back then. Air McNair. I remember I was watching, I was amazed. I mean, granted, like you said, the level of competition was what it was, but what he could do was incredible. But when you talk about Zach Wilson, I think what you hear is, well, Zach Wilson, there was a lot of debate about him as a prospect, and he wasn't the consensus number 2. Now, the debate and the not consensus number 2 stuff was what was going on Twitter, what was going on with draft analysts on the internet and stuff like that. And we're all a part of that crowd. So I'm not saying this to disparage anybody, because that's what we do, right? We watch stuff and we talk about it on our podcast or the internet. We're not in the league, right? So we find this a lot. And this to me is what Daniel Jeremiah's real value is. Yeah, it's nice to hear what his evaluation of a player is. He was a scout and he's got good insight, all of that. But what his real value is saying, look, I've been in these rooms. Here's what these scouts and here's what these executives are going to be looking at. Here's what they want to see. He's giving you a window into what the guys in the league are looking at and what they're going to think. He's connected across the league. And so he hears different things from a variety of people, and he can say, I've talked to 15 people in front offices, and guess what? Trayvon Walker is the guy that they have rated well ahead of Kayvon Thibodeau, which until Jeremiah came out and told us that, nobody thought that. And when he first dropped that bombshell, we were all like, what? And of course it turned out to be,
I didn't even believe it. I thought it was a team putting something out there to get somebody to jump.
Right. And look, this has happened numerous times. Remember with Mekhi Becton, he had Becton going in the top 10 when everybody was like, oh, he's a 2nd round pick. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, actually, but see, what I'm saying is, I bring that up as to say the way that guys in the league view things is often very different. Josh Rosen is a good example. Everybody on draft Twitter and all that, Josh Rosen, best quarterback in the class. Well, that's not how the league viewed him. He barely got drafted in the top 10 and then obviously washed out. But again, this isn't to say that the guys that are in the league doing these evaluations are going to be right all the time. It just means that they evaluate things in a way differently than what people see when they watch clips on Twitter or YouTube, or they watch the All 22, people that are not in these front offices. And so you go back, and Charlie Casserly surveyed 23 front offices at the time. 23 out of 23 had Lawrence number 1. 23 out of 23 had Wilson number 2. After that, it was split with Fields and Jones and Trey Lance and all of that. Okay. So the front offices differed on who was 3, 4, 5. But the consensus was that Zach Wilson was the 2nd best quarterback in that draft. Not only that, the Eagles and the 49ers, 2 famously poorly run franchises who are complete failures and did not actually play each other in the NFC Championship this past year, both tried to trade up for Zach Wilson. In fact, the 49ers wanted that pick at number 2. The Jets basically told them no, and that's when they pivoted to number 3 and ended up getting Trey Lance. The Eagles, who were clearly not entirely sold on Jalen Hurts, explored the possibility of trading up before they traded back to get Zach Wilson, and they realized they weren't going to be able to pull it off, so they made the move backwards instead, right? So that's where the revisionist history goes. Now, you can go and say, well, I watched this tape and I saw this flaw, I saw that flaw, and that's fine. That's fine. But I'm not saying Zach Wilson wasn't flawed. He had often way too much of a case of cowboyitis at BYU. And that was something that hurt him with the Jets, because he was a guy that would take these crazy risks when, as we said, sometimes just go with the safe play. And that was something he needed to learn and still sort of hasn't. But you go back and watch his BYU tape, you find me where he was overthrowing screen passes regularly by 5 yards, or completely missing wide open guys right in front of him. That wasn't happening on his BYU tape. It wasn't. And like you said, he was incredibly accurate downfield. He was making great plays. His mobility. Now, one thing that was a major area of concern, people talk about the competition, and that didn't really worry me. But one thing that was brought up, and I know Chris Nimbley, this was his principal question, and it turned out to be a prescient one, was Zach Wilson sitting behind that line of 24-year-old dudes at BYU who are keeping him clean. He's not having to face a whole lot of pressure regularly. What happens when Von Miller is trying to kill him? What happens when Myles Garrett's in his face? All this, right? And that obviously was something you couldn't possibly know until you saw him under center in the NFL. And unfortunately, the answer is he panics like crazy under pressure. It got to the point where it was so deep in his head that, as you and I were saying before we started recording, he was feeling pressure that wasn't there. He was running out of clean pockets, right? And when he panics, what he tends to do is either throw the ball away too early when there's maybe a guy open, or worse, take a bad sack or throw an interception, right? And the difference, and this is where people will talk about, well, pressure numbers are so important and this and that. Well, listen, again, couldn't have known this coming to BYU, but also when people talk about somebody like, say, Anthony Richardson, and they say, well, he has terrible pressure numbers, this is why you shouldn't draft him high. Well, the difference between Anthony Richardson and Zach Wilson is that if Anthony Richardson is feeling pressure and feels the need to bail, he can go run for 15 yards and a first down without breaking a sweat. Now, Zach Wilson's he's not a guy that has lead feet back there. He can move, he's mobile, but he's not a guy that's just going to routinely take off for a 10, 15, 20-yard gain. He's not, and that's where Justin Fields, remember, Justin Fields as a passer still leaves a lot to be desired. Now, he very well could improve drastically this year. It's certainly possible. Look at what happened with Jalen Hurts. But Jalen Hurts is a guy that, while he was still developing his passing and not really one of the better passers in the league with the Eagles, was making plays with his legs in the meantime, while he was learning, while he was developing. And that's what we saw from Fields. Unfortunately, Wilson he doesn't have that gear the way those guys do. So he couldn't do that. So when he panicked, instead of, like I said, oh, all right, he panicked, he got out of the pocket too early, but he got a 10-yard gain for a first down. It was, he'd run backwards 5 yards and make a mess. And so that's really where this came down to. You can never know how a guy is going to react to those types of situations when it's a regular occurrence until you see it. As I said to you, you can get your driver's license, you can take driver's ed, but until an 18-wheel truck almost takes you off the road, you don't know how you're going to handle that. You don't know how you're going to be as a real life driver, right? And so that's kind of what happened with Zach Wilson. Is he got the yips with the easy stuff, the screens and all that, and he started freaking out. And look, is it fixable? Maybe. I tend to think that if you believe there's any chance that this guy can be a starting quarterback in the NFL, he should be the third stringer this year. He should never be in a position to touch the football this year, because he's going to need what they call a redshirt year in college. And somebody says to me, oh, you're saying he's a redshirt year. That's only in college. Everyone knows what you mean when you say redshirt year.
Well, most people, I guess.
Yeah, most people should. He's not playing that year. You need that, because then you can have Hackett rebuild him and the new coaching staff. And look, if Rodgers comes in, everybody's making, I think, way too much of the Aaron Rodgers thing. Like, Aaron Rodgers is going to put his hand on Zach Wilson's shoulder, and all of a sudden, by osmosis, Zach Wilson is going to be an awesome quarterback. But the point is, he needs a complete reset. They know that. And look, everybody gave me crap, Glenn, last year. Everybody gave me crap when Mike White got hurt, and I said Joe Flacco should play. And everybody said, oh, he's done. You can't play Joe Flacco. I said, look, you're not going to do anything positive with Flacco or Wilson at this point, okay? They're just a body. But the difference is, with Flacco, who cares? He's got 1 foot in retirement. If he takes 10 sacks or something, whatever. Zach Wilson goes out there before he's ready to play, and it's just going to set him back even more. And that's exactly what happened. Exactly what happened. And so, look, I hope they're smart about this. If they really do believe, and I don't know if they do or don't, but if they really do believe that Zach Wilson has a chance to be a good quarterback, I would hope that they hold him back. But all those things that we talked about, Glenn, that's what went wrong. If you go back and watch that BYU tape, yeah, you could pick up some stuff. I'm not saying he didn't have flaws. Like I said, he had a little bit of cowboyitis. And there were some tendencies that he had even then where maybe he might throw in a coverage or whatever, trust himself too much, a little bit like what we saw from Brett Favre at times, things like that. But the stuff that really got him into trouble in the NFL, just not even being able to do the basic things right.
And if you look back, one of the things that when everyone likes to make their predictions and their projections, and here's why I think this guy's going to be good and why I think this guy's going to be bad. I don't remember anyone. There are people now saying, I told you Zach Wilson wasn't going to be any good and blah, blah, and that's fine. If that was your prediction and it looks like you were going to be right, that's fine. But I'd be willing to bet if we went back, you weren't saying he won't be any good because he can't hit the broadside of a barn. Everybody,
Right.
all anybody said was level of competition is going to get higher, and he's just going to get picked off left and right. He's going to try to make these tight window throws, and he's going to get intercepted by NFL DBs, as if no one completes a tight window throw in the NFL. It's not like he's out there with throwing. It's not like he's got Tim Tebow's arm and he's trying to squeeze. Like, he's got the arm if the window's there and he hits it. But nobody said he would end up, in the condition he's in now. And
those
it's
were
really
those were fair criticisms, by the way. So just to be clear, that's fine. It's just like you said, the revisionism of, oh yeah, well, everybody knew he wasn't going to be able to complete a screen pass. Okay, sure.
That's what I mean. It's the, like, if you told me a guy wasn't going to make it, fine. Like, I'll give you credit for making that call. But if your reasoning for why he wasn't going to make it isn't anywhere near why he didn't make it, then it's like, okay, well, you guessed right, but your logic of, he's going to throw 20 interceptions. I mean, for as bad as he was, he had, what, a 5 or 6 game stretch last year without a pick. But I guess it is hard to throw picks when you're not getting the ball near anybody. So,
right.
But nobody said that. Nobody was saying when this guy gets to the league, his completion percentage is going to be 46%. He's not going to be able to hit anyone, or 50%, whatever it is. So yeah, I don't mind the criticism. I criticize him. I said what you said the other day. I tweeted it out and I took a little heat for it. And I was you or somebody else corrected me. I think because this is like when the internet was in its infancy. So I couldn't recall exactly the sequence of events, but basically the year Parcells took a Super Bowl team, and I said he had Rick Meyer as his backup. Of course, he didn't have Meyer yet. They went out and got him after the fact. But I remember thinking, you just went into a season without a backup quarterback and with Super Bowl aspirations. And that's the way I'm viewing this year for the Jets, whether or not we think they're Super Bowl worthy. That's the way they're thinking, to go all out and get Aaron Rodgers. If you go out and get Aaron Rodgers and your QB2 is Zach Wilson, you deserve what happens to you if Rodgers goes down, because you are going in without a capable quarterback as your plan B if something goes wrong with your plan A. You've got to. They should have. Minshew should have been on the table. And the best guy out there now you could probably go after is Teddy Bridgewater. But if QB1, whether it's Rodgers or Tannehill or Stafford, if QB2 is Zach Wilson, you're kind of making a joke of yourself.
Well, yeah, and again, it's not even. Yeah, you could say, well, he doesn't give them any chance to win and all that. But I think the bigger point here is what we were saying before, which is if you truly believe he's fixable, you're doing him no favors by throwing him back out there before you've actually been able to fix him, which, again, he needs a full offseason, a full year to reboot if he's going to have any chance to be able to do this. And if you just throw him out there as the backup, and like you said, it's Rodgers, it's Stafford, whoever, and he's the backup and has to get forced into action, well, that totally screws up any possibility of him ever becoming anything. Now, you may be of the opinion, well, who cares? He's never going to be anything. Sure. But we're assuming that the reason they're keeping him around is because they don't think that. So if they don't think that, they're doing him no favors by throwing him in there. And by the way, I should also stipulate, because I've seen people say this, oh, well, what are you trying to absolve Joe Douglas of criticism? No, listen, just because Zach Wilson was the consensus pick there doesn't mean that Joe Douglas doesn't get criticized for actually being the one to make the pick. Of course, anytime you make a pick like that and it doesn't work out, the criticism is going to come because you're in that spot and you made the pick. And even though most of the GMs in the league, or maybe even all of them, would have done the same thing you did in your spot, ultimately you get judged by the decisions you make. And so, look, you look back in retrospect, and I would say, as of now, if you want to make the Fields argument, make the Fields argument. The jury's still out on him for me. But I think the clear answer here would have been you trade down and you take Micah Parsons, and then you accumulate a ton of different picks, and that would have been what you do. But you don't have the benefit of hindsight when you talk about this. So you have to just say, okay, what did he do there? And this goes back to like a conversation I'd had where somebody says, how could you trust Joe Douglas to do anything after he whiffed on Zach Wilson? And I'm like, okay, well, if that's your thought process, just fire Joe Douglas. If you can't trust him, fire him. But I'm just saying that is a black mark on his record that he will carry around with him for the rest of his time in the NFL. And he deserves that. He earned that. That's what you get when you make a pick that works out that poorly. But let's not pretend like this was the Christian Hackenberg pick where everybody and their mother was like, what? Christian Hackenberg in the second round? What? What are you doing? This guy, most teams thought he might get drafted. At best, he was a late day 3 pick. Why are you picking him in the second round? This wasn't that. This wasn't the Jets making some head scratching pick at number 2 and everybody going, what? How could you make that pick? That's not what this was. Like you said, he was number 1 most accurate downfield passer in college football that year. And we could rattle off all the stats. He was excellent that year at BYU. And a lot of the stuff that he struggled with, the basics part, I'm not talking about getting a little too brave for his own good, but the basic stuff, that's not stuff that you saw him have a problem with on his BYU tape. So like you said, the revisionist history is ridiculous. You're more than welcome to have thought that Wilson was the wrong pick at number 2 at the time. Okay. Plenty of people did, but let's not pretend like the consensus in actual front offices wasn't that Wilson was the number 2 guy. Let's not pretend that the 49ers and the Eagles didn't try to trade up for him. Let's not pretend that Zach Wilson was this fringe player that the Jets drafted at number 2, and everybody was like, how could you take him over Justin Fields? Because I keep seeing this argument. Well, since high school, it was Lawrence and Fields, Lawrence and Fields, Lawrence and Fields. Yeah, well, the conversation changed when Zach Wilson emerged that year in 2020. Okay. Now you can think that that was silly, but that's what happened. Zach Wilson emerged and all of a sudden he jumped the line. Okay. And like I said, the front offices and the coaches and all of that, they were all saying the same thing, that Wilson had jumped Fields. In fact, Trey Lance actually jumped Fields because he was the one that was drafted 3rd and Fields dropped all the way to 11. Now, again, you can say these front offices were dumb. How could they have not drafted Fields? And that's fine. But let's not pretend like the consensus wasn't where it was. Let's not pretend like Zach Wilson wasn't the guy that pretty much anybody would have picked at that point. And let's not pretend like he was a bad prospect. He was a really good prospect. It just hasn't worked out. Now, we could have a much longer discussion at some point in time, Glenn, if you want. I'm sure we're not going to do it now, about why it didn't work out. Was it the coaches? Was it Zach himself? Was it the players around him? We can go through a million different thoughts and theories on that. It didn't work out. That's on the general manager. That's on the coaches. Fine. But let's not pretend again that this was the Hackenberg pick, because now you're just trying to gaslight people. And again, I'm not saying people are doing this to be malicious. Some people are just like, I like Fields better and the Jets are dumb. And that's fine, but that's not where front offices were at the time. And we shouldn't act like they were.
All right. Scott Mason, Play Like a Jet. Great stuff as always. Go ahead and share what you have going on, Scott. And we look forward to having you on again soon.
Glenn, thanks for having me on as always, brother. I'm going to hopefully have you back on the show on Play Like a Jet soon. I love mixing it up with you. I will say this. I do a daily 7-day-a-week show. So if this carries on much longer, it's possible I may take a leave of absence to go to a rubber room. Not voluntarily.
I was going to say involuntarily.
Somebody might throw me a straitjacket. Good chance of it. But yeah, 7 days a week. The show's up on all podcast platforms. You can go check it out. Twitter is Play Like a Jet 1. YouTube channel is youtube.com/Play Like a Jet. One thing I will urge your listeners and viewers to check out, Glenn, is if you haven't checked it out yet, this past Friday show, Kevin Cole, who used to be at PFF and is now, and I think he was actually at Roto Grinders too, but that's his main thing now. And he's got a Substack called Unexpected Points. He wrote a great piece on his Substack, and we had a half-hour conversation about it, breaking down in detail why, if the Jets play this smart, they're actually in a really good position with the Rodgers situation. Glenn and I talked about a fair amount of it, and I added on to it even, and Glenn did too on this show. But check it out. Kevin really broke down the analytics and the numbers and all of that stuff, and as to why the Jets, if they're smart and Woody doesn't jump the count into the neutral zone, why the Jets are actually in a good position if they're willing to hold the line. Will they be willing to hold the line? I don't know, but Glenn will be talking about it. I will be talking about it at Play Like a Jet 7 days a week, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, all of that. It's always there. A new show every single day, even during the off season. So check it out.
Awesome stuff. Be sure to check us out on JetNation.com. You can follow me at AceFan23. That's ACEFan23. And you can catch Dylan Terman, at D Terman on Twitter. He and I will be back again live for Jet Nation Live this Thursday night at 6:30. Have a good one, Jets fans.